Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Bishop Brian Willett coming to you live from the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains on this February 22nd, 2019. Brand new episode of Vestiges After Dark. Tonight we are talking with Sister Mary Joan and Sister Maximilian about animals and the paranormal. Do they have an afterlife? Do they go to heaven? That's one of the biggest questions I get. We're going to answer that tonight. And we'll talk about totems and other aspects of the animal spiritual nature. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone, to a brand new edition of Vestiges After Dark. I'm glad that you all could join us tonight. I see that the chat room is heating up, and I am definitely looking forward to this discussion tonight. I think you're going to find that it's going to give us a unique insight into some of the things that are talked about quite often on Twitter, questions that come in to me. And most of the aspects of this show come from the questions that are asked on Twitter and people asking questions that are far and beyond the character limit. And, of course, I want to give a complete answer, and there's a lot of confusion out there. And over the past couple of weeks, I'm sure some of you have noticed that people are challenging me, and they don't really even are not even willing to present what credentials they have to even be able to refute any of the things that I share. I want to make it clear that when I talk to you about these things, I'm not giving you personal opinions, various biases that I've collected over the years. I am giving you personal, professional experience. So I don't even like some of the things that I have to share. They are just what they are. Some of it comes from ancient wisdom, and I share that with you. Some of it comes from, knowledge that was handed down from our ancestors that has been lost or forgotten or changed, and I try to give you the original meaning. Some of it comes from, again, direct observation from my work. And the one thing that I try not to do is put too much of my own personal opinion into it, because I don't see the value in that. I really don't. What should you care what my opinion is on these things? You really should only care about my professional experience, because that's the part that interacts with the rest of the world. That's the part that's relevant. And so, is there an echo? That's the problem with our setup here, and I don't know if there's much we can do to correct that. I can correct it, but it's going to be an issue when Sister Maximilian comes on, because her microphone is too close to mine, and because Skype is just a absolutely dreadful integration for doing podcasting. I hate it with a passion. There's no way for Sister Mary Joan to hear Sister Maximilian unless her microphone is right next to mine. And that's why you're hearing the echo. So what I did is I turned off her microphone while I'm talking, and when she talks, she's just going to have to we're going to have to turn it back on. And then, the echo might return again when she's talking. It's just an awful thing. It's only when we're using Skype. If we weren't using Skype, there's actually another thing that we could try doing. I could try bringing Sister Maximilian, even though she's here with me, I could try bringing Sister Maximilian into the podcast through Skype as well, and just put her in a different room on a different computer. And then she could talk through Skype, and then Sister Mary Joan could talk through Skype, and I could just be by myself in the office, and that would eliminate all of these problems, I think. In fact, that probably is what we're going to have to do in the future, because I did notice there was a bit of an echo last week, though it seems much worse tonight, and I do apologize for that. But I think that's the only way we're going to be able to fix it, because Skype is an animal, and not the good kind, not the kind we're talking about tonight. But, another thing I want to ask, if all of you could, is remember that this podcast, if it is something that you find value in, if it is something that you like, if it is something you appreciate, please support it by going to esotericcatholic.com and clicking on the donation button and giving us a donation, because you're the people who keep it on the air. We do this as an extension of the ministry of the church, teaching ministry. And I really do would like to see it keep going. But, again, all of these things cost money. Bandwidth costs money. Nothing is free. And just because we're a church doesn't mean that anyone gives us anything for free. They certainly don't. Everyone wants to be paid, from the landlord all the way down to the airlines when we travel somewhere, and right down to podcasting. Cost money. So if you can, donate to keep this show, on the air for well into the future, I would appreciate that. So let's just go ahead and jump into tonight's discussion. I don't really have too many announcements for you, other than the fact that I apologize that we're not doing this weekly anymore. There's just not enough time for it. But I am trying to do it at least bi-monthly. For the time being, we are working on some projects, working very hard at getting a television show together that may be viable enough for the networks to purchase, and I've been spending a lot of my time working on that, so that would open our budget up to be able to travel nationally and to be able to reach more people and help people in other states. That's a big concern of mine. There are some very severe cases out there in our queue that we cannot get to because the budget just does not exist to go and travel there. And so it would be really nice if we had those resources coming in from a production that would allow us to be able to get out there and help those people. So that's what I've been working on. So that's kind of the reason why I haven't been as available for this. We also have some changes going on in the ministry right now. We're going to be making some major changes to how it operates, again, because of funding problems. So if you can help us out, we would definitely appreciate it. Anyway, let's get started tonight. So, Sister Mary Joan, how are you tonight?
Good evening, everyone. How is everyone tonight?
Are you in the chat room too? Are you able? I see. Okay, you are there. Okay, good. So you'll be able to follow. If you see any questions in there that you would like to respond to, feel free to interrupt me, okay? Because I don't always see all of the questions that come in through the chat, but I see that it is definitely it's hopping tonight.
And everyone, bear with me because I am not a good typist.
Just let us know. You can just read the question on the air, and we can handle it verbally. I'm going to try putting on Sister Maximilian's mic, and you've got a button here, Sister Maximilian. So go ahead and turn yourself off when you're done speaking. You're going to hear a little click because there's no way around it, just because of the nature of the equipment. But it will eliminate the echo that you're probably hearing right now. Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody.
How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good.
Okay, that's good. All right, so go ahead and turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. I think that will help there you go. Okay, that's going to help the echo issue. Of course, when you come back on, it is next week. What we'll do is we'll just put everybody in different rooms. I think that's going to be the only way to solve this, with Skype being the way that it is. So let's get started with the topic tonight. Okay, so we're talking about animals and the nature to the paranormal. And, you know, we've got some interesting stories to tell from our own investigations, you know, that involve animals. And we've even had personal experiences with pets that we can even talk about tonight. I'm sure each one of us, Sister Maximilian and I have shared experiences with this, but Sister Mary Joan, I'm sure you've probably had encounters with animals, pets that have passed on.
Oh yes, most definitely. I can definitely tell that story.
Absolutely. So we'll talk about this, which certainly gives us some preliminary insight into the nature of this topic. But it's a complicated topic, and as I was mentioning to Sister Mary Joan off the air just before we went live here, there's the question of whether or not animals have an afterlife. That's a fairly easy one to answer. Okay, but the problem gets more complicated when people ask me, do animals go to heaven? Because, you know, of course, when somebody's talking about heaven, we're usually discussing it in the Judeo-Christian context. And there's theology that must be considered in order to fully understand the question. And by virtue of even asking the question, do animals go to heaven, it already assumes a certain misunderstanding of the theology. And we're going to really break this down. So, again, I try not to get too theological on Vestiges After Dark. I try to save that more for Vestiges of Christianity, which we really don't do that much anymore. But, you know, that's the show that when I have to get really theological, I prefer to do it on that show. I try to make Vestiges After Dark a little bit more entertaining, a little bit more enjoyable and relaxing, you know, that you can go and maybe have a scotch or something and sit back and just kind of listen to the discussion unfold. It's informal and, you know, just an open discussion. But tonight I can't dismiss the theology to answer the question. But hopefully by the end of the show, you'll have a better understanding as to why the answer is the way it is. Because another thing that I see a lot on Twitter is that people will ask me a question, and I will give them a very sincere, honest, professional answer. And they don't get the answer they want. They shouldn't have asked the question in the first place, because honestly, really, if you aren't able to accept whatever the answer is, then maybe you shouldn't even ask it. Because I don't like when people ask me a question with the preconceived answer already in mind, and they're checking to see if I'll agree with them. I really think that about 25 to even 33% of the people on Twitter are doing that. They will ask me a question, not really wanting my answer, but wanting to see if I agree with theirs before I even know what their opinion is of it. But again, that's what it really is. In the end, it's an opinion. And I don't want to talk about my opinions. I don't want to talk about your opinions. I want to give you the facts to the best of our knowledge, but the best model and language I can give you, considering how the ancients looked at this, considering how theology looks at it, and then putting it together into one cohesive picture. And I think you're going to, if you're really open, I think you're going to like how this unfolds. Because I think there's a little bit of something for everybody in this answer. And we're going to need the whole show probably to really arrive at that place. But I really want to start out with the animals going to heaven thing. Because that's the most complicated. That's going to need the most time. And the rest of this discussion can unfold more naturally after we've explained that particular area of this topic. So, do animals go to the Judeo-Christian heaven? Now, the short answer, the simple answer is no, they do not. And the answer to that is, the reason for that is because of what the nature of heaven is. And see, already we're getting to the point where people have a misunderstanding as to what the nature of heaven is. They want to understand it as a location in time and space. It's not. It's a condition. Okay? Not a place, not a location that you go, a condition that you arrive within. And that condition, from a theological vantage point, is the perfection of the resurrection. Okay? So understand that, again, this comes from this misconception that we are naturally immortal. A lot of people have this idea that we're just immortal, that we, by our very natures. Even the church kind of uses language that would lead one to finally conclude that, yes, no matter what happens, we're already immortal. But that's not what Scripture says. Jesus grants eternal life, but they want to add a qualifier and say, oh, it's eternal life with God, it's eternal life with heaven, just as they would look at hell as a place of eternal punishment, where you suffer for all eternity. Okay, which, again, the scriptural basis for that is very limited and more of a medieval creation. It's not how the ancients would have seen it. And as we've talked about on this show before, and if you really want to look into those discussions, and we're not going to be able to get into that tonight, but when we talked about the afterlife on previous episodes of Vestiges, whether it be Vestiges of Christianity or Vestiges After Dark, we've already discussed the nature of the human afterlife, what going to heaven is, what purgatory is, what limbo is, what hell is. Those designations still apply here. Heaven is intrinsically a human condition, because heaven is by its very nature a property of human experience and intelligence. So when we get down to the question of whether or not animals go to heaven, the best way that I can answer that is, why would they want to? I drink a nightcap almost every night. Right now I'm on a Scotch kick, so I've been drinking some wonderful single malt Islay Scotch. Okay, I've been having Bowmore 15, Lagavulin 16, and I'm loving it. Okay, but I can tell you right now, if I go and pour my cat a glass of Lagavulin 16, he's going to turn his nose up at it. And that might be the best case scenario. Okay? He's not going to want to drink that. Okay? Because the quality of enjoying whiskey, something as sophisticated as a single malt Scotch whiskey, is a human experience. It's a human condition. It's not something that animals can participate in, and it's not something that they even want to participate in. It's not their nature. It's not their thing. Well, yeah, okay, some people are saying their dogs would drink it. Well, of course, there are dogs that will take anything. I knew a dog that would eat lemons and hated every minute of it, but it just kept going back for more. So, that's some of that's just kind of weird dog behavior. They're just happy to get something tasty in their mouth. But when I'm talking about enjoying Scotch whiskey, I'm talking about the palate of it. I'm talking about being able to detect the nuances and being able to appreciate it at the level that a human being can. Okay? It's not about whether or not they'll consume it. Yeah, some animals will consume it. Cats won't. Dogs might. But neither one is going to be able to enjoy it like a human can. It's not possible. They don't have the intellectual capability to be able to comprehend things like, the qualities of a 16-year-old versus a 10-year-old whiskey. How the refinements of those extra 6 years, what it does to the liquid, how it softens it and makes it smoother and more elegant. Okay, animals are not going to be having that kind of consideration with it. Not to mention that, for those dogs out there that would drink Scotch whiskey, if you pour a little in their bowl, they'll probably gulp it up in one shot. Whereas, a person who's trying to enjoy a nice Scotch will probably, be able to enjoy a couple ounces over the course of maybe 20 or 30 minutes. Because they're experiencing the Scotch, not just drinking it, not just consuming it. Dogs are consuming it. Animals are consumers. But we, as human beings, are able to intellectualize the experience and to a higher level, and then we can take the act of drinking whiskey and turn it into an affair that is beyond any other living things understanding. It's not to try to say, oh, well, we're so superior and they're so inferior. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just merely stating that in reality, you're not going to be able to sit with your German Shepherd and discuss the finer nuances of a 30-year-old Scotch versus a 16 versus a 10. Okay, that's just not going to be a conversation you're going to be able to have with your German Shepherd, no matter how much whiskey he drinks with you. Okay, and if, like I said, if it's a cat, forget it. So we have to understand heaven in that context first, because that's the very basis for how we understand this thing that Jesus gives us. Okay. So when we look at how the relationship of human beings with animals arrives theologically, we have to take it back to obviously the book of Genesis. And that is, Genesis chapter 9 and 2, where we have the stories of how the animal kingdom was given over to man to be stewards of, where we were given permission by God to consume animals and use them as we needed, not to abuse that privilege, but to use them in a moral capacity, which which includes eating them, using their fur for clothing and warmth. This is, from the Judeo-Christian theological vantage point, moral, because it's in Scripture, where it's been granted to humankind for that purpose. They also participate in the fall of man, because now they die too. Okay, because all of creation was immortal prior to the fall, and so they experience death like we do now. And that's where we start to get into these complexities, like, well, what exactly would an animal afterlife be if heaven, from the human understanding of it, doesn't apply to them? And that's where we have to get back to some of the things we've talked about before. Maybe it's worth mentioning a little bit tonight, some of the background. So as you recall, we have to do a little spiritual anatomy. Okay, and the spiritual anatomy of a human being is the same, actually, to a certain extent, on two levels, but not the third with an animal. So, of course, just like an animal, human beings have a body. So animals have a body, human beings have a body. That's the physical nature. That's the corporeal nature. Okay? And that's the part that we interact with and see, obviously. And that's the part that when the body dies, that's where we start to feel the loss and sadness of a beloved pet or something like that. Or even another, human being, of course. Because we're very corporeal creatures, and the experience of losing somebody close to us, animal or human, is painful. But just as human beings have a corporeal nature and animals have a corporeal nature, we both have a spiritual nature. That's the non-corporeal. Those are those aspects of ourselves that don't fall into the physical. Okay, that's where we're going to start to experience thoughts, feelings, and the very spiritual nature itself, the embodiment of everything that would be considered life. Because the spirit is what breathes life into us, and it's the spiritual nature that animates us. Okay? So the non-corporeal side, animals have that too. And when we talked about human afterlife, that when the body dies, of course, the decomposition process begins, which is very obvious if you don't take care of the corpse in a timely manner. Same thing for an animal. Okay, they will decompose at pretty much the same rate that a human being would. But just like a human being, the spiritual nature decomposes much more slowly. And that surprises a lot of people when they hear me say that, because again, they think that the spirit is immortal or something. No, it's not. It's just an energy system, and energy dissipates. The whole thing about, I hear people say, well, of course everything has an afterlife because energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes form. And while that's true, that's not a really good argument for an afterlife, because by afterlife, you're assuming that all of that energy remains cohesive. And we know that energy does not remain cohesive because it's subject to entropy. It fizzles out. Yes, it can't be destroyed, but the cohesion of it can and does and is. Even suns, stars die. It just takes a long time. But the energy eventually burns itself out and it dissipates. The same thing goes with the human body, the animal body, and the spiritual nature of both. Okay? So when a person reports a recent death of a pet, it's very common for them to still feel the presence of the pet around for a while, just as it is for the death of a human being that was very close. They will feel the presence. Things will be moved around. They might even hear their voice being, their name being called by the voice of the person who passed on. Same thing with animals. You'll feel, if it's a cat, sometimes you'll feel your cat rub up against your legs, or you'll see them in the corner of your eye running across the room. And that is something that is very typical and to be expected. That's the spirit of that animal. So yes, animals do have a spirit, just as humans have a spirit. The complicating factor for when we start getting into something like afterlife and heaven is the nature of a soul, which is intrinsically different than a spirit, as we've talked about on this show before. And again, I don't want to go too far into that because that could take us on a different tangent altogether. And we've already covered this a few times before, so you'll have to just look in the archives and listen to that if that interests you. But when we're talking about the animal side of this, we need to at least cover some of that which we've covered before. And so the soul is a completely different characteristic. The soul is the divine nature. So when the scriptures talk about, again, I'm talking from a Judeo-Christian vantage point here. We'll get into other traditions as we go tonight, but we need to start at that basis because, when we're talking heaven, that's what we're talking about. And so when we are talking in context to the Judeo-Christian heaven and human nature, the soul is that divine aspect that the Bible talks about when it says that we were made in God's image. Notice how Scripture doesn't say that cats were also made in God's image, or all living things were made in God's image. Human beings have this special privilege. Jesus Christ didn't come as a dog. Okay, he came as a man. And that's because there's a special relationship that God has with humanity that is not shared with the rest of creation. That special nature is part of the intrinsic soul. Now, animals share in the divine aspect of a soul in terms of, God's love of them, and them being part of the creation, and them being even initially immortal before the fall, original sin and all that. But they do not share, they are not made in God's image. They are not designed to be co-creators with him. They are not called to the divine act of, or the wedding feast of the Lamb, which is, again, something that is intrinsically human. And so, because of that difference, because that we were made in God's image, we were made to be restored to that former greatness prior to the fall that the sacraments of the church provide. This is why you can't give your dog communion. It would be a sacrilege to do that. This is why you don't baptize your cat, because they can't share in that life. And I can tell you right now, they don't want to share in that life. It's not their story. They have a different story. But this one is not theirs. Okay. Now, that being said, there's some things that we have to cover, because it's not that simple. It's not as simple as just simply, because when you talk to the Roman Catholic Church, what they're going to say is, no, animals do not have a soul like a human being does, so they can't go to heaven. Jesus didn't come to save animals too. He came to save human beings. Okay. So that's the answer you're going to get from the Roman Catholic Church. But we have to take it further than that. This is the beauty of this show. It's the beauty of the Nicholean tradition. It's esoteric conceptualizations of things, how it can look beyond into metaphysics. And we need to answer some outlier questions. And one thing that comes, and this was something that actually came from a child once, that if heaven represents to us perfection, which would have to mean that it also represents perfect happiness, right? Could a person who loves their pet, and there are people out there that really love their pets, okay, they don't even see them as pets, they're like parts of the family. I've seen families treat pets better than their own human counterparts. Okay, I've seen this. So the question is, can a person who has a beloved pet that they've lost ever truly be happy if their pet cannot join them in eternity in that condition that we call heaven? Could you ever really have perfect happiness, is what this child actually asked. And I've heard varying answers from various priests along the way, and I kind of like to maybe combine a couple of the answers. One is that it's kind of like looking at the way that we love our pets is kind of like looking at life through the eyes of a child, okay, where we see reality around us under a very limited veil of understanding. And that limitation makes us think that we could never possibly be happy without all of these corporeal things, like human relationships, animal relationships, all these things that we put so much value into while we're here, not realizing what the beatific vision in heaven really includes, what it's like to be fully immersed in the presence of God, and how complete that would make us. So one answer that the church has given to this question is, you won't care if Fido is no longer with you, because you will have received true fulfillment in the presence of God. And so, therefore, our previous relationships just don't have the weight that they did. They were just shadows of the kind of relationship that we will one day have with God. And so, therefore, because we don't understand that, it feels painful to us now for the loss, but the fullness of God, once we have experienced it, will fully take away any deficits that we might have experienced prior while we were alive. So that's one answer. Another answer is maybe a little bit more simplistic, but valid, I think. And that is, well, let's say that one's happiness does include all of the things that they've lost, having that restored too. Not just one's nature restored in the resurrection, but everything that that person is, including the relationships they had with their pets. And if that's the case, then what would be there to stop a person who has entered into that state of perfection from reanimating their animals all over again? I mean, the substance is still there. The energy that these animals were is still there. It's just not cohesive anymore. That's the part that dissipates. And that's really the difference between a person who is saved and a person who is not saved. Is that a person who's not saved, that energy dissipates and eradicates, becomes nothing. And a person who is saved is restored whole. So what would stop one who is now at the level of co-creator, fully able to embrace what it means to be made in the image of God, to have all of those qualities that are truly godlike qualities? If you don't believe me about that, just read about the Eastern Orthodox theosis. What's to stop them from reanimating their pets? What's to stop them from being able to restore that happiness if that's something that is so valuable to them? There wouldn't be. And so while it could be said that animals wouldn't naturally enter into, your pets rather, who have passed on, wouldn't naturally enter into the kingdom of heaven, that's not to say that you couldn't restore them to that condition if your happiness depends upon it. And that's a perfectly valid metaphysical vantage point in this discussion. There are theologians that would disagree with it. However, I think it is definitely something that is worth full consideration, because through logical, philosophical inference, it would have to be so. Okay? But what we have to understand about all of this is that there would have to be some kind of intelligent intervention in order to change the way things intrinsically work. Now, this is different than talking about whether or not there will be animals in the kingdom of heaven. Because remember, the kingdom of heaven is ultimately a completely restored cosmos. It's a condition again. It's not a place. It's a condition. And so just as this cosmos currently contains a plethora of non-human life, and just as this universe, this cosmos exists both physical and spiritual, it has corporeal aspects, it has non-corporeal aspects. The same will be true for the new heaven and the new earth that is to come when the old heaven and the old earth pass away at the end of time, when the cosmos is fully restored, made new again. And so there would be no reason to assume that animals would not be a part of that new creation, since they were a part of the creation before the fall. Why wouldn't God continue along those lines from where he left off? It would be perfectly logical to assume that. But that's not what we're asking when people are talking about, do their pets go to heaven? Because you're talking about animals that have died in your lifetime before the cosmos has been restored. And that's a different question altogether. Okay? So we have to, in order to answer this, understand that theology. We have to first understand the theology of Genesis, what it means when the natural world, including animals, were given, man was given dominion over them. We have to understand what that means. And we have to understand their spiritual nature and how we differ because we have that other thing that involves being made in God's image. Okay. So that's kind of where we're going with this entire discussion tonight. So getting back to the question, do animals go to heaven? You can see why it's not just a very simple no. You have to explain why this is, and you have to explain all the caveats that come with it. And hopefully I've done that thus far. I don't know. I mean, I haven't been looking at the chat room. Sister Maximilian, has anybody asked any questions so far about what we've talked about just now?
The main question is, how do we break it to the animals?
How do we break it to the animals? Though, I mean, they don't really. They're not really concerned about those things. See, this is the problem. We tend to anthropomorphize our pets, and they don't share those concerns that human beings share. They're not worried about tomorrow. They live in a perfect present, and existence and non-existence are as natural to them as waking up and falling asleep. Death is not frightening. Now, the types of dying might be frightening, but death in and of itself is not. Lack of control can be frightening. That's frightening for both humans and animals. But in reality, they don't share a foreboding worrisomeness about, their future terminal illness or something like that. That's not things that animals really concern themselves with. So, there's nothing to break. They're very much comfortable and content with the way the natural order is at the present time.
I think that's a good vantage point to take, and that we can learn a lot from them as far as living in the moment. There's no regretting the past. There's no looking forward to the future or anticipating something in the future. It's, you're opening a can now. You have food for me now. You're not going to have food for me in 5 minutes. It's a different way of thinking, and it's something we can definitely learn from.
Yes, and that's part of the confusion. Now, I see somebody in the chat room, Bert, is saying heaven will not be physical, and so many people believe it might be. Well, that's because Scripture makes it very clear that it will be a restoration of the cosmos. Okay, heaven, we tend to think like heaven is some condition that exists now. It doesn't exist now. Heaven, the kingdom of heaven is being ushered in. It's being built as we speak. And the physical nature of it is going to be just as it is now, where it's both physical and non-physical. It's just going to be different than the way it is now because it's going to be perfect. But just as Jesus, and see, this is where the Scripture gets into it. The whole reason that Jesus had Thomas touch his wounds after he resurrected was so that the apostles would know that he wasn't a ghost, that it was the same person, that he could be touched and yet still pass through walls. The physical resurrected Christ is going to be the same type of physical resurrected body that the rest of us who will share in the resurrection get to experience, which, of course, makes very clear that the future kingdom of heaven is going to have physical characteristics. It's just not going to be the kind of physicality that you know now. It's not going to be a type of physicality that that expends energy in the way that it does now. So like consumption is not going to be necessary. There won't be economy. There won't be scarcity. It will be a perfectly ectropic condition. But that is absolutely scriptural there. Okay, that's not metaphysical inference. That's not esoteric, exaggeration. It's very conventional theology. The kingdom of heaven is absolutely going to be both a spiritual and physical experience. But it's not that way now, because the kingdom of heaven is being created. See, we tend to think that heaven's already there. And in some way, when you consider the timelessness of God, it is. But we're not existing in the timelessness of God. We're living in time. And there's a linear process to this that has to be built, which is why the fact that even though Jesus died on the cross and eliminated all of the sins of the world and conquered Satan, we still have evil to contend with, because we're in the process of eradicating it. And that's what the church militant is all about. But I don't want to go too far off into theological, conundrums there. I just want to make it very clear that, yes, the scriptural theology as it exists in its current conventional state, without having to take it too far into the metaphysical or the esoteric, has perfect allowances for there being both a physical and spiritual side to the kingdom of heaven. Any other questions before we move on?
No, there's really not been anything else in the chat room.
Okay, so Sister Mary Joan, anything you'd like to add to this part of it before we jump into the next part of this?
Well, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but, animals do have a different purpose than we do. We're two completely separate things, but they are our companions. They're meant to be our companions, and they're actually teachers. We just have to allow ourselves to listen and learn from them. And we are social creatures. We are meant to have pets. We are meant to have animal friends. So that's something to definitely think about. And that's why we get so attached to them. They have an innocence about them that we can't grasp. So I think that's one reason why people are so connected to their pets, is because we're kind of jealous in a way of their innocence.
Yeah, and their ability to be so natural, I think,
yes,
is also something that is worthy of envy when you really think about it. Because as we look at how animals interact and behave, they can do so naturally and effortlessly, where human beings can even talk themselves out of their own natural instincts and abilities. They can create complexes within their psyches that can inhibit their progress. It's not something that animals tend to experience, unless, of course, you're talking about abusiveness, but that usually animals that have the consequence of an abused psyche, it's because they interacted with a human being that made them that way. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So,
and one thing with animals too is someone just mentioned the unconditional love. That's true. Animals don't care what color you are, what whether you're male, female, your creed. They love you unconditionally. Mm-hmm. We have those biases and prejudices that we can't seem to get over, but yet animals don't have a problem with it.
Right. So that brings us to, and before we're almost at the top of the hour, so let's talk a little bit about, and see how far we can get into it, about afterlife. Because, see, that's the whole thing. Animals do, by virtue of having a spiritual nature, and the spiritual nature, as we've established, decomposes at a slower rate than the corporeal, and can linger just as human beings can. There can be spirit attachments with animals, just as there are with humans. There is an afterlife. There is a sort of experiential awareness that they possess, because they do have awareness. They don't have intellect like we do. There's intelligence, varying levels of intelligence. Obviously, dolphins, cats, dogs are going to be operating at a much higher level than, hamsters, mosquitoes. We're talking about even birds. There's varying levels of intellect. But what they all have in common, even right down to single-cell amoeba, is awareness. There is a fundamental property awareness built within all of them. Even plants have a rudimentary property of awareness. I wouldn't call it intellect because we're not talking about, brain activity, and we're not talking about reason and rationality or higher thought. But, cats, for example, have a prefrontal cortex, and you can definitely tell that they have one because there are certain rudimentary skills that they possess that allows them to figure things out at a more sophisticated level than lower animals, for example, like a reptile. But there's awareness in all of them. And I don't think you can really say that one animal's more aware than another. It's really intellect that kind of gives the illusion of that, okay, a human being seems to be more aware than perhaps a lizard. But at the base level of awareness, it would be the same. So animals are a product of awareness, just as human beings are a product of awareness. The thing that makes us different is the fact that we are made in God's image, which means we have a certain divine characteristic that is unique to us. We have a God-like character, which is what we call the soul. And this is why, you might hear some Christians talk about how animals do not have a soul, and that really riles up a lot of animal lovers because they're like, oh, yes, my pet has a soul. I know they do. Well, what you're really referring to is their life force, which is built into their spirit. And yes, that is an extension of the divine, but it's not in the same way. There's not a rulership of it as we possess as being genuine children of God. And so let's talk about that afterlife condition. Because honestly, this is the frightening part of it for some. It might be comforting to others. You guys will have to decide for yourselves where you fall in that spectrum. But the afterlife condition of an animal is identical to the afterlife condition of an unsaved human being. There's no difference. None at all. Because in the end, we are primates too, biologically anyway. Okay, so we're part of the animal kingdom. We're part of this. We're a species on this planet, just like every other animal is. And so it's only the fact that we were made in God's image. Spiritually, that's not a physical thing. It doesn't mean that God has, the appearance of a man. But it means is we have his nature as well as an animal nature. We have both working within us. The animal side of our nature has the same experiences in the afterlife that any other animal would. So for a person, if we're going, let's get back to Judeo-Christian theology here. And like I said, we'll definitely save some time for other traditions here tonight. But we always start off with that because, I'm a bishop and these are my nuns here, the part of this church, and this is a Catholic discussion. So we start from that basis, and then we, of course, give honor to other traditions down the road. But when you're looking at a person who is unsaved, and what does that mean? Well, from the Catholic vantage point, it would be someone who has not received baptism. It would be somebody who has rejected Christ, who has not cultivated a relationship with Christ, has lost faith, has committed grave mortal sins. These are kind of Catholic language, but still, it's if you all need clarification, let us know, and I will do my best to answer, any questions you have about this stuff. So a person who dies in that state is not going to be raised to the kingdom of heaven. That's not something that's going to happen. They will die. The spirit will be released. The spirit will depending upon its condition, either dissipate or linger. But it will either dissipate immediately or it will linger and then dissipate. And then it just becomes reabsorbed into the energy of the cosmos itself. And is getting a little esoteric now. This is not conventional theology. It gets recycled. And this is where we start to get into where we have to branch off into Eastern philosophy to talk about what that recycling process is. And that is where we get started on the discussion of reincarnation. But of course, it's not what people think it is. Okay, because we're not talking about a continuity of self. We're talking about a continuity of energy. Okay. So that dissipation process, that spiritual release process, that reabsorption process, that crossing over into the energy of the cosmos is the same for human beings and animals. And that's the afterlife condition. Is there an experience to that? Well, there's a fundamental property of awareness that doesn't go away, but it's not a self. And your animal doesn't go into this condition and say, oh, I'm still that cat that used to hang around, on your lap every night. That's not the kind of experience that the spiritual nature of that animal, the fundamental property of awareness that that animal possesses will have, any more than you would. You're not going to go into that afterlife condition with this understanding that you are you. In fact, it's going to be usually quite confusing. Animals handle this better because they're used to being in a state of perfect natural, just a natural state of awareness. Human beings are always trying to control their awareness through the intellect. So when you lose the brain, you lose the ability to intellectualize, and you also lose the ability to comprehend, and you lose the ability to have conscious experience, because all of that is brain activity. So human beings don't really do raw awareness very well. Animals are all natural about it because that's their primary experience. So animals really don't experience the afterlife much differently than they did their living life. The only difference is there's less physical suffering. The dissipation doesn't hurt. As the spirit breaks down, it just naturally fades and then reabsorbs into the cosmos to be spawned again into something new. But it's not that experience is not painful, but for a human being it can be quite terrifying because we've lost control and we're used to control. Animals are used to not being in control, except for what is natural to their survival. So it's kind of like the answers to this is kind of like having to rework the way you think about things like afterlife and what your definition of heaven is. And we're going to have to kind of break down this a little bit further here as we progress into this tonight. But we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to take a break here, and I hope you guys don't go away. Enjoy the music while we take about a 7 or 8 minute rest, and we'll be back after this.
I am able to keep pushing my limits and all the drive that I have. Well, I'm going the distance with you. I didn't know what I had till I knew what was missing, and everything that I dread. Well, I built a resistance with you. Catch me when I fall, and I'll keep you on the ground. You were gone, I wish you'd stay. I could look at you for days. Time was well spent, that's when I knew that I need to spend my life here with you. not in the fast lane. I understand that you've been broken too many times, but I'll be waiting to mend your wounds from all you've taken. But if we listen to each other, admit our mistakes, then I can show you who I am, because I'm not the same. I'm better with you. I'm better with you. I'm better with you. Catch me when I fall, and I'll keep you off the ground. That's when I knew that I need to spend my life
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for staying through the break. And we're talking about animals and the paranormal, the nature of their afterlife condition. And I see a lot of questions coming in the chat room. We've got some questions that we'll tackle when we get back here. So go ahead, ask away. See you in just a moment. Don't go away. I see a lot of people in the chat room talking about the ashes of pets, and I really wanted to say something here and kind of remind you all of one important point from the last hour that we talked about. Remember, there is no spiritual difference between a human being and an animal. The only difference is the nature of their soul. And that is what determines whether or not we are eligible for that status of entering into the condition of heaven as a child of God versus being just part of the creation itself, which doesn't make it any less sacred, by the way. Don't think of these things in terms of importance or whether or not something is superior or inferior. It's just the nature of things. It's the way that the structure of the cosmos is ordered in order to maintain its fundamental balance. And animals are perfectly content with it being this way, so should we. And yes, somebody was talking about ego getting in the way. Absolutely. That is 100% correct, and ego will always work as your enemy almost every single time when it comes to things of a spiritual nature. So understand that, animals have very limited ego, if anything at all, and, they are far more natural about the whole process of things. So believe me, they're not unhappy with the way things are. But as far as ashes go, they can produce the same kinds of attachments that human beings can, because the spiritual natures are identical. Okay, so if you keep your ashes of your pet around, that's just as problematic as if you kept the ashes of granddad around. You just don't want to do this. They need to be ritually rested, no matter what. Now, for animals, it doesn't have to be a long, complex process because you're, again, not dealing with the ego nature like you have with a human being. So all you have to do with an animal is just rest them. So I think Sister Maximilian mentioned in the chat room that, one of the best things that you can do is perhaps scatter them in a location where they felt comfortable, something that would have been familiar perhaps, or a location that seems that it would be conducive to their well-being. Somebody was talking about, wanting them buried on their property, and so they were holding onto the ashes so that the pet would still be with them. That is less ideal. Remember, if you are properly resting your animal, after it passes on, then that's really going to expedite their dissipation and crossing over if you scatter them immediately. And there's not going to be any further attachment to those remains, within days. It will be over with. So it won't matter anymore where the ashes are, because the spirit will have what we call crossing over, which is really just reabsorption into the cosmos. Okay? So don't hang on to them for that reason. That's only going to create attachment. And just like human beings, as spirits remain trapped through attachment, they degenerate into something that is malevolent. So the same is true. Now, the only difference is that animals don't have the same energy structure that a human being does. They're not as sophisticated in that respect. And so the malevolence of a unrested animal spirit is not going to be as problematic as one from a human being. But it shouldn't be taken any less seriously. And why would you want your animal to degenerate like this in the spiritual nature? Why would you not want them to move on into their natural condition? So help to expedite that, and it makes it best for everybody involved. And so, yes, that would mean scattering them in a place that is peaceful or would have been familiar and felt safe to them. If you do this, within days, they will have all the energy will have scattered, and the ashes will be nothing more than just atoms of material at that point, just matter. Okay? Hopefully that answers that question. I know that there's other ones here. Sister Maximilian, what else do we have?
Let's see. So we also have the question of whether animals can see spirits.
That's a good question. Yes, absolutely, without any question. In fact, one of the things that we do on our intake, not our intake form, but our assessment form, when we are assessing whether or not there is a paranormal disturbance in a person's life, and we're trying to determine if it's of a demonic nature, one of the questions, or several of the questions, in fact, involve whether or not there's animals in the house. Do animals behave a certain way? Are they afraid of a particular individual in the house? Do they react to certain locations in the home? Absolutely. Because, again, they don't have that ego reality that human beings do that kind of filters out some of that spiritual data. And they're not being conditioned like human beings are to only focus on the five senses. They, again, exist in a more natural state. They are more comfortable with the raw faculties of awareness that is intrinsic to all of creation, and so they're very much more comfortable with the spiritual side of things. And so, yeah, ghosts wouldn't frighten them like it would a human being, because they are used to seeing that energy on a regular basis. And all places are haunted. We've talked about this. All places are haunted. The only thing that really makes the difference between whether a place is classified as haunted or not is the level of activity, if it is able to break into the normal range of consciousness of a person that would otherwise not be able to experience it. But animals can always experience it because that hasn't been conditioned out of them. It's part of their normal sensory experience. So yes, absolutely, without question. What else do we have, Sister Maximilian?
Not in the chat room, but I did have a question from someone in my real life. She wanted to know if animal spirits can become malevolent.
Yeah, and we kind of already covered that. Again, if they are not allowed to be rested, if the human being that, if the owner of the pet was not able to let them go and facilitated their developing an attachment or getting stuck, then yes, all spirits degrade into or degenerate into a malevolence or a malevolent form eventually. Hopefully that energy dissipates before that happens, but not always. And if a person is exceptionally traumatized by the death of a pet or not willing to let go, sometimes you even hear of people doing taxidermy, and these things are not favorable. Now, that's not to say that it will happen every single time. There's a lot of different factors that can contribute to the degeneration of a spirit into a malevolency via a spirit attachment. And sometimes you can do everything wrong and the spirit still moves on. Sometimes a more sophisticated spirit will not be affected by how human beings make mistakes with their after-death care. And, of course, the same is true for human beings. You will have people that will... There have been people, again, when we were talking earlier at the beginning of the show, people trying to correct me on Twitter, telling me that I'm wrong. Not giving me really any credentials or anything for why they would want to refute my professional experience, but just telling me I'm wrong for the sake of it. One of the things that people like to tell me also is that, you talk about how holding on to ashes are such a bad thing to do, but I've held the ashes of my, so-and-so loved one or whoever it was, for years, and there's never been any problems. I've never had any paranormal disturbances. I've never had any attachments. And that's great, but that's usually because, for whatever reason, that particular individual did not respond to, or was more sophisticated and was ready to move on. And certainly that's the whole point of the sacraments of the church, to give us the grace necessary to move on so that we don't get stuck in that immediate condition after death that the Buddhists call the bardo. We don't really have a Western equivalent for that term. It's just kind of the that halfway state where before you go, before you're no longer really alive, but you're not quite dead yet either. You're sort of in that halfway state. Buddhism calls that the bardo, and that's a very dangerous condition typically, but if one has enough grace and has cultivated the faculties of awareness to the point that they are able to navigate that condition, then they won't get stuck, even if you are absolutely doing everything wrong, not ritually resting them, holding the ashes. I mean, there's all sorts of different things. Mourning too much. The worst thing that you can do, honestly, is not letting them go emotionally. And that goes the same for human beings as it does for pets. These things can lead to attachment. And if you're dealing with a spiritual nature that is less sophisticated, it can recreate havoc and turn into a malevolent force. So always best to rest the ashes of anyone that has passed on, regardless of whether or not it is a human being or a pet. Sick souls. I'm not quite sure I remember talking about that.
That was brought up by someone else in the chat room.
Oh, okay. Okay, I mean, that's not my term.
Sorry, I'm doing a little too much.
Yeah, I mean, what, Sister Mary Jo, what was the context of that? Maybe I can help you.
It comes from, Whisper says, animals often won't like people with sick souls, faults in their spiritual disposition, etc. She kind of answers it as she says it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean,
I agree.
We're vibrationally, we vibrationally resonate at a certain level. As we raise our vibration through grace, through prayer, that is what actually helps to create the conditions for a more moral, holy, functional person. But just as we can raise it, we can lower it. And, as we raise it, we become more vibrationally compatible with the angelic realm, or those higher realms of divinity. And just as we can do that by sinning, by committing acts of great evil, we lower our vibration, which becomes more and more compatible with the demonic. And so as we change our vibration around, yes, animals are going to be able to feel that. So when animals can sense what we would think of as a bad person, it's because they can read that vibrational resonance. And that gives them a lot of information as to who's a good person, who's someone they can trust, and who's someone that they need to stay away from. So it is very much true that if there's an animal that is a very good animal, because even the animals can have these vibrational differences. I have seen evil animals. I have.
Oh, yeah.
They exist. And so if an evil animal doesn't like you, that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It means that you're not vibrationally compatible with it. And, there's not really an evil animal, but it's what it is basically a low vibrating animal. And there are some that do fall into that category. But that's more rare. You don't see that as often. And usually it's the result of some kind of abuse or something. But like a really good, loyal dog that, is really gentle with the children in the house, and if somebody comes around and that dog is reacting violently to somebody, and that's not normal for its usual behavior, that's typically because there's something intrinsically wrong with that person's vibration, which would be an indicator that there's something else going on in their life. Yeah. Okay. So I guess does that answer all the questions? Sister Mary Jane, did you see any that we haven't covered before we move on?
There was one more.
How would you know that you're experiencing a malevolent animal spirit?
That's it, yeah.
I got you. Okay. Well, it's going to be, again, a more lower grade type of experience, just like it would be with an animal. Okay, so it's not going to have the same levels of sophistication that you would experience from a wrathful spirit, for example. The only thing that can make it challenging is that there's really no difference between a lower level elemental and a malevolent spirit or animal spirit. There really isn't much of a difference because intrinsically they're almost one and the same thing. So you wouldn't be able to tell that as much, but you would be able to tell the difference between a malevolent animal and a fallen angel, for example, or a malevolent animal and a tulpa, or even a human being that's passed on that doesn't have the best intentions and is sticking around to wreak more havoc. You can tell because it's about the sophistication of interaction. Sometimes there's a lot of biting, just like an animal would, in these kinds of things. It's something that we see with the lower forms of elementals. Even with the scratching, you have to be careful with, because scratching can sometimes be even a benign spirit trying to reach out, and that's just how we interact with it. So again, there's really, for the layman, it can be hard. That's why professional assessment has to be very careful. It's time consuming, usually more time than people want to commit to it. And Sister Mary Joan will tell you that we almost never have enough time to ever really do an investigation as fully as we'd like. Usually there's all sorts of conditions that, where we have to kind of make sacrifices here and there and try to get as much information in the shortest period of time as possible. So, but if you could do in an ideal world, if you could do everything right, it would probably take several weeks of assessment to absolutely definitively get it right on the first shot. It absolutely would. Okay, so we got a half hour here. Let's start talking about totems and animal guides. And these are things that come from shamanic culture, going back to pre-religion, you might say, because, the first religion was actually more animistic, and it was more of a natural type of conceptualization. The entire cosmos was considered to be spiritually alive. We've lost some of that in our more secularized, scientific-minded culture. But yet, it is still very much there. It's just we don't pay attention to it. And in the beginning, our ancients really saw there to be no difference between spirits and the spirits of animals and spirits of human beings. It was all a wash of spiritual data. And animals would be something that one could commune with. In fact, in some cultures, you became your animal guide. You became part of whatever that animal was that guided you through existence. That would be your spiritual form, your condition into the afterlife. And there is actually some truth to this. Of course, it's archetypal truth. It's not the same kind of truth that we would use in scientific observation, of course, but it is an archetypal type of truth. And so, yes, spirit guides are real, and spirit animal totems are absolutely very real. Now, Sister Mary Joan has a unique relationship to this field of study. It's something that is part of her own culture identity, and something that she very much resonates with. So, Sister Mary Joan, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what you know in regards to this subject, and I'll just be quiet here while you share your insights.
Well, my obviously I studied shamanism for a few years when I was trying to get back to, the ancient way of doing things. When I walked away from religion several years ago, and of course I went into the shamanistic arts, and basically every school of thought has a different interpretation on it. But the way I had learned and accepted was that all of us have somewhere between 4 and 9 totem animals. Those are your power animals. These are the animals that are with you throughout your entire life. They cover you on all of the sacred directions. You have east, south, west, north, above, below, within, and then you have 2 main ones that walk on your left and your right, and they are with you throughout your entire life. So I subscribe to the 9 totem animals. And then you have your spirit guides who come and go throughout your life. They come to teach you a lesson or make you see something or kind of point you in a certain direction to help guide you on the path you should be in. One thing I found interesting when I first started studying shamanism was that the word animal itself comes from the Latin word anima, which means breath of life. And then you have, we call creatures wild animals when they're not domesticated. Well,
Yeah.
Wild is actually the Anglo-Saxon word referring to living free within nature and not under human control. So wild animal it's kind of a very spiritual meaning of the words in and of itself. And they are brought to us, I believe, by the divine creator, God, to show us how to slow down, realize what's important, and to be more caring of each other. And that's where I get back to the unconditional love thing. And every animal has its own characteristics, its own ways of doing things, its habits and patterns of life. And if you just watch them, you can learn a lot from it. Everything from, wolves are my power animal, and they live in packs. They're very family oriented. They mate for life. One of the few creatures on the planet that do. Humans can't even say that much these days. They show affection, but they have authority, over each other, the alpha and the beta. So there are many, many lessons we can learn from nature and animals. If you just let go of your ego, they have a lot to teach us. But that's the basic thing of totem animals. They share our characteristics, our feelings, our abilities, our talents, our challenges, and they're with us throughout our entire life. Almost like guardian angels, but not guardian angels. They're our animal.
Yeah. See, the thing is
guides.
that I think, again, something we've gotten away from in more modern versions of religion, spirituality, as well as, just our externalization of consciousness into the 5 senses, where we've lost some of our understanding that the ancients would have had, or maybe even taken for granted, which might have explained why we lost it, is that the reality of the spiritual world is really the inversion of what we think. We think the reality is this existence, the 5 senses of corporeality, that everything that you see around you, we call it the real world. We say, like, in the real world. And then if something is happening that other people are not experiencing, we'll say, well, that's all in your head. And we have the kind of, idea about things that says that the external world that we all share and can validate, like I can see something and then you can look at the same thing and then we can agree that it's one thing, whereas a thought or a feeling might not be as easily conveyed, and is more mutable and subject to interpretation. And what that makes this, it creates this illusion that the physical world is the real world. But it's actually the other way around. And the ancients knew this. And so when you're looking at physical animals like birds or wolves or, these are vibrational manifestations of something that's existing, a condition, a spiritual reality that's existing on a completely spiritual level that is invisible to us outside of the fact that it imprints its nature into the cosmos, and we get to see it in the form of an animal or a wolf. But it's a real spiritual dynamic that's alive. And these things are what the ancients were connecting to. And they knew that the animals in nature were reflections of this higher truth, this higher spiritual reality that they were a part of. And even human beings themselves were a reflection of some higher spiritual reality. We just call that thing God. And this is actually true. Metaphysically, at the very highest level, any esoteric field knows this. It's just conventional religion that's had a problem understanding it, because it tries to objectify everything and moves us into all these different directions when we really need to pay more attention to what the ancients knew, because they had less ego influencing them, and they weren't subject to these changes that science has made, this objectification that, isn't a bad thing for certain types of things, but it's not. I get frustrated when people try to use science as an explanation for why God doesn't exist, because it's like science isn't even qualified to make that assessment. It can only make observations in the physical world, and this is something that does not exist here. Not like that. It's not qualified. And I'm going to really blow people's mind, but let's pretend for a moment. I know that there were some reports going out recently, I've read in the past several months, even in the last couple of years, really, that there have been some high-level physicists that have really starting to contend. They've got some good data to support what their contention is, that we actually are living in a simulation, that this is some kind of very sophisticated virtual reality. And there are some scientists out there that genuinely believe this. They see certain patterns of binary code, and they are convinced that there's good evidence to support this. So let's assume for a moment they're right. Let's say this is a massive computer program that we just happen to be a part of, some kind of virtual reality that we're connected into, and we're able to experience things according to the rules of this program. Well, the problem with that is that all the laws of physics are written into that code of that program. So if your program does not allow for you to see anything that exists outside of the program, and what program does, then it would not be qualified to make any assessments about it, any more than the little Mario in Super Mario Brothers, any more than he could have any information or any means to be able to tell anything about the person playing the video game. He could not do that. It's not part of his program to be able to observe the person playing it, nor would it be even part of his program to even know that he's a video game, because the rules are designed to just basically follow the commands that the person doing the inputs is doing. But if Mario had consciousness, he would think he was the one making those movements, when really, in reality, it was coming from someone else's mind that's not even in the program. He's outside of the program. Just as we could say that God exists outside of the universe. Okay? So the problem I have with science, which gets us back, I think, to understanding this whole dynamic, is that it only works for the rules of this program. So anything that exists outside of the dynamic of the cosmos, it's not qualified to even answer, because it could even be programmed to create the whole thing like a lie. If it's programmed to actually deceive the observer, then science could only deceive you. It wouldn't allow you to see the truth, because it can't step outside of itself in order to truly observe what's really going on. And that's precisely why it cannot give us any determinations about God, which is really a stupid thing for somebody who has dedicated their life to science to even argue that just because science can't prove God, that God mustn't exist. It's like, that doesn't even make sense. That's not even good science to say something like that, because the absence of data doesn't make something not true. I mean, if that were true, then X-rays wouldn't have been real until they discovered them. But we knew that they were around all this time, but we didn't know they were around until we figured them out. But that didn't mean they weren't existing before, and now they do. Same thing goes with God, but there's no qualification there. So all of this comes back down to the idea that the spiritual world is the real one. Okay, that's the one that's calling all the shots and making everything happen here. And the ancients knew this. And so all of that information that comes from the divine source is being channeled in through all of creation itself. So the animals were instruments of this information, conveyors of divine knowledge. And if one would tune into the particular animal that resonated with their intrinsic vibration, they could have a genuine relationship with the divine through that experience. And that's what a
yeah,
totem
and if you
is.
notice, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt,
No,
but
go.
one thing
Go ahead.
people need to realize is almost every ancient religion, the gods and deities and goddesses had animal familiars. I mean, just look at the Eastern Indian gods and goddesses. All of them rode upon an animal. Shiva rides a bull. Ganesha is on a large rat. I mean, all these animals, they're messengers from the gods and goddesses of the ancients.
Well,
And,
look at the
people
Book of
knew that
Revelation.
the divine
I
being
mean,
was present.
Look at the Book of Revelation with the horsemen and
Mm-hmm. On the horses.
Right. I mean,
Pale horse, the red horse.
Yes. Animals are a continuing theme archetypally because they do convey a certain higher spiritual truism. And that truth can be tapped into, and there's information there if one is keen enough to discern it. And this is ultimately we come full circle now. This is ultimately what the animal afterlife is. Because what they are is they return to their intrinsic vibration and become one with that ultimate reality that is what they were a reflection of the entire time they were alive. So it's really a coming home, but it's just not an individuality. And it's the same thing for human beings. We tend to be, we're so individualized. We're so protective of our identities. We're so protective of who we think we are. And we're nothing. We're nothing outside of the whole of the cosmos. But we think we are. We think we're more important than we are. We try to see ourselves as separate from each other, as separate from the world around us. And when people commit real acts of evil, it makes it very easy to say, well, I'm not like them. I'm better. I don't do those things. But unfortunately, what that does is it writes the wrong story. And it leads us further into spiritual deception because we lose the concept of wholeness in which the entire cosmos is built. See, animals don't have that problem. Animals know this. They know this. They already understand the wholeness, the collective reality of which we are all a part. And so, when we're talking earlier about how animals, do they see spirits? Do they see ghosts? And well, this is the same thing. They can, and they are also more tuned into the entire spiritual reality that exists all around us. So, as we break down every aspect of this subject tonight, hopefully what remains clear is that animals are just fine. Living, dead, these are just parts of the process that they manifest through. But there is a certain eternal condition that is built within their archetypal resonance that is truly eternal and is part of the cosmos and will always exist in some capacity. Sister Mary Joan, somebody was asking how you know what your totems are. How would you go about figuring that out?
Well, usually you don't pick them; they pick you. But the most common way is to meditate. Sometimes they'll come to you in dreams. Sometimes it'll be an animal that you'll see actually physically in an odd place, and you'll keep seeing them over and over and over again. And some of them could be animals that you've been attached to your whole life and don't really understand why. Like, say someone's spirit animal could be a turtle. And you don't know this, but you walk out your front door in the morning and there's a turtle walking across the sidewalk in front of you. We call that a clue in shamanism. I had last year, we've discussed this, where I was having I needed to make some decisions on which way my path was going to go, and I was uncertain of it, and dragonflies started appearing all over around my property. One even landed on the antenna next to my car while I was outside talking on the phone, and it did not move. Normally, if you even flinch toward a dragonfly, they'll take off. but it
Right.
just sat there on the end of my antenna and stared at me like, "Are you seeing me yet?" So, it'll become obvious the more you look into it, what your animals may be. And so, you have several. There's just different schools of thought on how many. But they will make themselves known to you. You just got to pay attention.
Now, what about divination? I mean, I know that that's another common way in shamanism, which an individual might reach out to connect to the spiritual world, and that's essentially what it is. I know it invokes fear in Judeo-Christian minded people, but it shouldn't, because it's actually an intrinsic part of almost every more primitive religion, and also some of the more sophisticated Eastern ones. It's never been ever seen as an evil thing. It really comes down to just the fact that pagans did utilize it, and Jews had such a terrible relationship with pagans during their the history of their biblical story that Christians kind of inherited the bias against it. But when we're talking about communication with spiritual realities, divination is how it's done. So, what are your thoughts on using divination in terms of being able to connect with some of these totems?
Well, I actually have a set of medicine cards, and they're basically animal tarot cards. You can use that as long as you read the book and study it before you actually try it. I also have a ceremonial drum that when I want to connect, I'll lightly tap on the drum and get a rhythm going, and I'll start a low hum, like a chant, and ask in your mind's eye for the animal you wish to speak to come to you. And if you can really let yourself go, get away from all distractions, you'll be surprised what happens. It's like a deep meditation comes over you. I'll listen to native flute, helps. There are music CDs and downloads I'm sure you can get that have Native American flute music, and there's a old album, it was called Thunder Drums, and that was something I used to listen to for a long time. I don't know if you can still get that or not. I know the name of the album's Thunder Drums. I don't remember who did it, but there's many ways to do it. You can do it the Sacred Circle, and there's something also called shape-shifting, which that can get pretty deep. You're not actually turning into the animal, people. It's just where you open yourself up and put yourself into that animal. I've actually had deep dreams where I felt like I became the wolf, and I could feel myself running through the woods. I could feel myself breathing, touching the ground, and it was in a dream, but it was very, very real. That's the best way for me to connect with the animal world is to meditate using the drum.
I know that,
but the cards are good if you know what you're doing.
Janet in the chat room is asking, do the different types of animals have meaning? I know that, again, getting back to
yes.
where we're talking about vibrational alignment, just as each animal has a certain type of characteristic about them. A lion might be fierce and fearless, versus, maybe, like you were talking about, the protective nature of a wolf. There's different characteristics there archetypally. Yeah,
the wolf is loyalty and courage. Snake would be rebirth. Every animal does have its own distinct characteristics and lessons. And like I said earlier, you can study animals and their behavior, and it will become obvious what their traits are. Like the mountain lion, they're leaders, natural leaders, and they may be telling you something if you see one of them out in the might see one in the low mountains somewhere. Yeah. Even squirrels can give you lessons. The possum, fox, that's all about camouflage, and they're also known to be little tricksters, telling you to, work on your sense of humor. There's all different kinds of ways, and there's also what we call a contrary. When you're using the medicine cards, if you flip it upside down, it can be a contrary, so it may be showing you what you're doing wrong in life, whereas straight up it may be giving you a positive message, But if it's upside down, it's helping you realize what you're not doing right, and that you may need to rethink your current situation and move forward. So the animal card spreads are very good. I like to use them because they're instant connection. And no matter what spread I do, when I read the meanings of each animal, it always pertains to what I'm going through at the time. They're very accurate.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no question about it. My students in Forbidden Truth will certainly tell you that, divination and the whole genuine study of the topic, we're not talking about playing around with, New Age books, but actually, really studying the more ancient techniques that are involved. I can't think of one practice that is more powerful in terms of how we could literally communicate with the divine and have a conversation that takes away some of the ambiguity. But again, it has to be taught. I mean, it's not something that you just can't go to the store, pick up a tarot deck, and expect to get some viable results from it. One has to have a relationship with the energies one is reaching out to first. And that can sometimes be a lot more work than people are willing to put into it. But it's no less necessary. And so, what we do in Forbidden Truth in the webinar, and if anybody's really interested in studying that with us, please sign up for it, because I would love to have more of a full class. It's really a smaller class right now, but we still have some seats available for those who would like to learn more about these things. And just go to Nicholean.org or esotericcatholic.org and click on the webinars link at the top of the page, and you'll see the Forbidden Truth registration page. Just register and become a student of mine, and we can talk about these things, because even though I'm a Catholic bishop, that's just one function of my work. I tell people all of the time, I am first and foremost a teacher of mysticism. And yes, Janet, 86 classes and counting. We have had 86 classes, if you can imagine. And there's just so much data there. And the good news is that there's an archive. So if you're even coming in late, you can catch up. All of those are available. You can see, you can watch any of the previous classes that are there. And I'll tell you, we're very methodical. Some, I think, people found it to be too methodical, and that's why they're no longer with us. But it has to be that way. If you don't develop the relationship with each individual archetype, you'll never be able to actually use divination safely, because there is danger to it. The church isn't completely out of its mind when it condemns divination. It just doesn't really get into the give any clarity as to why they condemn it. And really, it comes back to bias on one level and the dangers of it on the other. And yes, it does unlock doors to sometimes dark places. And if you don't know how to deal with those things, it can be very disruptive to your spiritual life, very dangerous. And so, that's why we study it the way that we do, more in the ancient shamanistic way, and not so much in this new agey kind of, I guess, neo-pagan way. But,
yeah, and I do want to say something, because you hit it on the head. You don't just go to a New Age bookstore and pick up these tarot cards or these books and think you can just start throwing them on the ground and get answers. You do need to establish that relationship with nature. When even if it's just going out into your backyard and taking your shoes off and what they call grounding, putting your bare feet on the grass and scrunching your toes up, you'd be surprised how much better your body will feel when your feet is actually touching the earth and feeling that the earth in between your feet. When you go on hikes, ask permission to enter the deep woods. Give honor to the spirits that are there. Literally hug a tree. We call them the standing people in native cultures. Literally, give thanks to their being, honor their creation just as you're created, and bring them gifts, whether it's a small crystal, a pouch of tobacco. Show that you're willing to learn and have a relationship with them, and you'd be surprised what you get back.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, for mentioning all of that, because I think it's always worth, people need to understand how this works. The relationship is how it works. Okay,
we all have the same creator. That's what people have to remember. We all have the same creator, so we need to honor each other and each creature. This
is where the church, unfortunately, has kind of gotten it wrong, because they just zero in on the dangers without understanding the reasons behind those dangers. And what makes divination dangerous is not divination. What makes divination dangerous is the lack of spiritual relationship. And it's the same danger that you'd have in Christian context, with not having a relationship with Jesus Christ is dangerous to your spiritual salvation. They understand that part of it, but they're not seeing it through to the rest of the equation. This is why I do not dismiss other cultures or their practices. Remember, only in the Judeo-Christian worldview, and I guess to a certain extent this includes Islam, okay, only in those three religions of the book is divination condemned. Every other religion on the planet has some form of divination, and it is all considered so holy that in and of itself it is considered a sacrament for those religions, or at least the sacramental equivalent. So how could we be so arrogant as Christians to say that something that is a sacrament to all of these other people, billions of people around the world who are using these things perfectly fine and getting a divine experience out of it, how could we say that this is evil or wrong or sinful? It's actually, I would say disrespectful, and honestly, just plain out inaccurate. So I am what it is. What it is. There's going to be a lot of traditional Christians that will just absolutely, balk at whatever the entire idea of it. But it is what it is, and I can tell you from personal experience and having studied these traditions, there is true spiritual power there, and it is holy. It is of God. It is not satanic. Anyway, we're at the end of the show, and I hope this
that happened quick.
It goes so quick, 2 hours like that. I hope that you found it informative. We will be back next month in March sometime. Just watch my Twitter, because I don't have dates right now. Things are very up in the air. We're going through a lot of changes. So by all means, just watch Twitter very closely. Or if you're on Facebook, check Facebook. And I will always put out an announcement when we are having the next show. It will be in March. I just don't know when. Hopefully we'll be able to do 2 in March. Let you know. We'll let you know when we know more about our schedule coming up. Okay? So take care, everybody. I'll see you then. God bless. Good night.
Remember, everybody, go hug your pets now.
Or a tree.
Or a tree, yeah.